take a look at the exercise you did last week involving lithics. Or actually, that was 2 weeks ago, involving lithics. Just wanted to give you an idea of some of the possible uses of the tools that you looked at. A lot of times archaeologists will use use-where analysis and experiments to figure out what a tool could have been used for. And in this case, form follows function. The shape of the tool can be, will allow it to be good for certain activities, but not so good for other activities. So you had a blade like this, and this would have been comparable, as you can see behind there, to kind of like a pocket knife. Some blades had one edge and one sort of non-sharpened edge, or were kind of a larger area that wasn't sharp, and then a sharper edge on the other side. And that could have been used kind of like, again, like a knife, but allowing you to put pressure on one side, maybe to cut through meat, cut through tendons, things like that. So a one-sided blade, like a pocket knife, would be good for that. You also saw a couple of examples of burins. Burins are chisel-like tools that you saw one particular example that kind of had a little notch here. And burins allowed humans to carve into bone and also antler and make tools from the bone and antler. So as we said, this was kind of a big development in the development of modern humans, because modern humans made tools with the specific function of making other tools, and that's kind of an important point there, because it shows a lot of planning ahead, that they're making a tool in order to make another tool. They could make a needle out of antler or bone, which they would use to stitch up clothing and things like that. You also saw a blade that had a notch at the end, right? That it was kind of curved at the end. And this would be sort of like a woodworking tool, like you could see here. It would be good for trimming, let's say, pieces of wood and turning them into spears, sharpening the end there to be used as a spear, something like that. So you saw a tool kind of like that. It's hard to tell these things from the 3D models. I understand that, but it was just a way to kind of give you a chance to try and do that. You also saw a tool that was pointed, and this would obviously be good for penetrating leather, skin, hide. It's like a drill or an awl. An awl, you probably have used awls before. You would use it to punch into leather so that you could stitch it up. You also saw a blade that was sharpened at the end in this kind of circular formation, and this would be good as a scraper. So this could have been used to scrape off fur, or off of the skin of an animal in order to prepare the skin for leather or things like that. So, or to scrape the meat off the skin. So different kinds of scrapers were produced by people. So you can see that with modern Homo sapiens, there was a huge diversity of different kinds of tools that were produced. Many of these tools had a specific function. Here's a side scraper, so different kinds of scrapers. You also saw a point, a spear point or arrowhead point that had a shoulder to it, which sort of, was a interesting regional development. And later on, the tools got even smaller. So by the time of the period just before the Neolithic, in the Middle East, you had what are known as microliths, where they were making small blades and then using those small blades to then put together to make sickles or to make harpoons, like you can see here. These kind of almost look like a saw projectile. So those are the kinds of tools that people made during that time. Let's talk some more about zooarchaeology and what zooarchaeology can tell us about ancient societies and ancient humans. So far, we've seen how zooarchaeology can help us look at diet of people, subsistence, which is, how they made a living, where their food came from. It could tell us potentially about social status, that some people maybe had access to better cuts of meat than others. It could tell us a little bit about the domestication of animals, the process of domestication. So archaeology can help us with climate reconstruction, figuring out, if there was a change in the climate over time. It can help us understand seasonality patterns. That is, where people living at a site during a certain season or a certain time of the year. So one last issue we'll look at is ethnicity. In some cases, zooarchaeology can tell us a little bit about ethnicity. Well, what is ethnicity and how is it different from race? Most of you are probably familiar with these terms, and you're familiar with ethnic groups and things like that. The important difference is that ethnicity is based on culture, and race is a designation that's supposed to be based on biology. Right? Anthropologists today have a lot of issues with racial categories because they don't actually match what you see on the ground. Right? But for example, Hispanic, Latino, Latina, Latinx, that would be an ethnic group. Why? Because it's based on an identity and it's based on culture. You could have two people, one, that potentially could be from the same quote unquote racial group, right? One could be someone born from Ghana or Mali in West Africa, and the other one could be born in Jamaica. And someone might say, well, racially they're both of African descent. That would be kind of a racial group. But let's say Dominican Republic versus West Africa. The person born in the Dominican Republic might identify as Latino or Latina because they grew up speaking Spanish in the Dominican Republic. They were from that Caribbean island. A person from West Africa would identify as West African. That would be their ethnic group. So ethnicity doesn't overlap with race, and ethnicity archaeologically can be very, very tricky, as you can imagine. Today, how would you identify someone from being from a certain ethnic group? Well, certainly language would be one way. If people grew up speaking a certain language, this is an example of Quechua, which is a native language in South America. They might identify as being from that ethnic group or not, but not necessarily. It also can be marked, or people can be accustomed to certain ways and styles that when you see these styles, you might know, oh, that's typical of this group or that group. So I like to use the example, since I'm familiar with it, working in the Middle East, of the keffiyeh. Different ethnic groups wear the keffiyeh differently. This is sort of the Arab style, where you can see it that has the headdress over here to hold it in place. It's usually long, hanging down, whereas the Kurds in like northern Iraq and southeast Turkey kind of wear the keffiyeh rolled up and tied like a turban. Right? And if you were, for example, in Mosul, where Arabs and Kurds live together, you might see different ethnic styles of dress. Right? Also, architecture is another one. Different people have different styles. Right? So ethnicity tends to be choices that deal with style. But the problem archaeologically, as we've said before, is that pots don't always equal people. Right? Style can be a conscious choice, not necessarily unconscious. And as a result, if you find a certain pottery style, does that mean you've identified an ethnic group? Not necessarily. In fact, probably no. You can't make that case. In places like the Southwest, where this pottery comes from, we don't have language. There's no writing there, so we don't know what language they spoke, which is a typical marker for ethnicity. So it can be challenging. And this is where zooarchaeology comes into play. Zooarchaeology and our preferences for certain kinds of food actually can be markers for ethnicity. And this is what you're going to look at for one of your exercises this week, which I'm going to explain. So in this exercise, you're going to calculate how ethnicity can correlate with food preferences and with diet. And you're going to do this sort of pretending you're a zooarchaeologist of the future, right? Or you don't even have to do that. Really, you're going to look at different ethnic restaurants. I have some menus I got from online from New York City. You're going to look at the different menus, and every time you find a pork dish or a chicken dish or beef dish, you can see the categories here, you'll kind of count it. So you'll tabulate it. So you'll have restaurant 1, for example, maybe you'll have 5 pork, 3 chicken, 10 beef, etc., etc., etc. And then what you're going to do is you're going to make a stacked histogram. I'll show you that in a minute. And you're going to see what are the patterns between ethnicity, right? That is, do certain groups avoid certain animals or not have access to certain kind of animals? Are there groups that eat the same kinds of animals but eat them in different proportions? Let's say they prefer one or the other. So here are the menus. You can see some of the menus here. So the first one is Texas barbecue. So you chop, basically Texan ethnic group, I guess. But most of these are pretty straightforward. If you don't know what something is or what meat might be in it, then just skip it. Kielbasa tends to be pork, right? So you've got like if again, hot links not necessarily clear, but brisket is beef, kielbasa is pork, pork shoulder pork. Next one, for example, Ithaca. So this is Greek food. Moussaka is eggplant, as you can see. It usually gives you, here's lamb. It usually gives you what is in there. Shellfish versus fish. So if it's shrimp or something like that, you can put in the shellfish category. Pakistani restaurant, so Pakistan, so north of India. New Big Wong restaurant, so Chinese restaurant. Queen of Sheba, Ethiopian, East African. Jewel of India, Indian restaurant. So you're going to go through these, and then you're going to use this Excel spreadsheet, and you're going to put the numbers in here, and you will then select the data. You don't have to figure out the percentages because Excel will do that for you. And then you want to create a chart. So you would insert a chart. You would want a histogram. And remember that you want a histogram like this or like this. Okay, this is just the vertical. This is the horizontal. You want it to be 100% stacked column, right? That is, you don't want the raw numbers. You want the percentages because it's very difficult to compare things using only raw numbers. It's much better to look at percentages. So all of the columns are going to be stacked, and they're going to be the same height because they all add up to 100%. You want each column, each of those stacked bars to represent a restaurant, not to represent a food preference, or not to represent a food type. Let me just show you how this will work. All right, let's just take this as an example. I just made up some numbers here. You would select this data. I'm not going to do it for all of it, but just to give you sort of an idea, then I would choose this stacked histogram like you can see here. Okay, now what you see is that it didn't do it the way I wanted to. It did it, by animal type. So what you would do is you would go right click, select data, switch the row and the column, hit OK. Okay, now it looks a lot better. It looks like the way I want it. So restaurant 1 versus restaurant 2. You could say, oh, restaurant 2, they eat a lot more beef. They do have pork and chicken, and they do have pork, chicken, and beef here as well, but the proportions are different. The ethnic group in restaurant 2 much prefer beef over the other ones, even though they do eat the others in smaller quantities. Right? This kind of histogram I find to be very useful in visualizing data and looking at trends. And this is the kind of histogram that you can use when you're doing your cemetery project, as I'm going to kind of review a little bit this week as well. All what you're really doing is instead of having restaurants, you'll have time periods. Instead of pork, chicken, and beef, you'll have maybe the kind of stone that the grave was made out of. But again, I find these kinds of charts to be very useful. So that's what you're going to do with your data from the menus. You're going to look at the different ethnic groups, and you're going to try and answer some of those questions. Let me give you an example of how this is used archaeologically. An example where you can see people doing zooarchaeology in order to look at ethnicity. Okay, so there's a little bit of background to this first example. And we have to go back 5,500 years ago to the beginning of civilization. This is a time period that I focused on when I was in graduate school. And 5,500 years ago, here in southern Mesopotamia, what's now southern Iraq, between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, the first civilizations arose out of irrigation agriculture. And the first city was called Uruk. And this time period where it became a large city is called the Uruk period. This is the remains of a ziggurat, and you can see some of the other areas of the city. It's hard to really, because it's in ruins, it's hard to really kind of grasp how large this city was. But it was an enormous city, and it was really probably the first city or one of the first cities. It was certainly one of the largest cities ever in the ancient world. This is maybe what it looked like back then. Now, down in southern Iraq, they had lots of water and lots of good land to grow crops, but they didn't have any wood, they didn't have any metals, and they didn't have any stone. And the only way they could get these things was by trade. And this is what's known as the Uruk expansion. Now, these are very typical kinds of Uruk Mesopotamian artifacts. These kind of cruddy bowls. These were disposable beginnings of writing. You can see here this little spouted vessel. So the Mesopotamians had to find sources of metal, stone, and wood up in areas of what's now Turkey and also Iran. And what they did is, it looks like they left Mesopotamia, and some archaeologists think that the Mesopotamians set up trading colonies hundreds of miles away from the heartland of Mesopotamia, up on the Euphrates over here. So these yellow dots show sites where they found Mesopotamian pottery. The blue dots, or the red dots, show sites which had local pottery of people in the area and also some Mesopotamian pottery. So what are these colonies? How can you actually identify a colony? Were Mesopotamians really there? Well, people think they're colonies because the material culture, the artifacts in these sites are all southern Mesopotamian, but they're found hundreds of kilometers away. But there's other possible explanations for this, right? But they found Mesopotamian-style houses, Mesopotamian-style artifacts you can see here, the beginnings of writing, those disposable bowls, the spouted vessel, right? So some people said this is clear evidence. You look at the pottery, you look at all the other artifacts. It's not just pottery, but it's architecture. It's built on, a site that was built completely new with this foreign style. It's probably Mesopotamians coming up there. Other people said, well, not so fast because there are other explanations. One Possible explanation is that local people are imitating foreign styles. So the people living there are, locals in ancient Anatolia or Turkey, but they're copying all the styles of Mesopotamia. That's a possibility. So how do we figure out if that was going on or not? Well, I worked at a site in Turkey called Haji Nebi, it was a local site, local Anatolian site, but during that Uruk expansion, it had an area with all Mesopotamian artifacts, right? So it was a pretty big village, not a city, right? And the local people had already started to develop, beginnings of social complexity, we could say. But in that one area, there are those, you can see those Uruk Mesopotamian artifacts. They even had these things that were beginnings of mosaics. And they had something else that you find in Mesopotamia, clay sickles. Why did they use clay sickles in Mesopotamia? Because they didn't have stone. Well, why would they make clay sickles up in Turkey where there is stone? Maybe it has something to do with culture. It's just what they're sort of used to, side by side. So archaeologists looking at the Uruk expansion, looking at these sites, had different explanations for what they found. Many archaeologists thought that sites like the one I showed you were really colonies, that Mesopotamians were living there. That's why those foreign-looking artifacts that were identical to ones from southern Mesopotamia were there. Other people thought that maybe the pottery was made specifically emulating the style of Mesopotamia, local people in Anatolia making their pottery look like foreign pottery. So how could we tell if Mesopotamians were really there or not? Well, one of the ways that was attempted was through zooarchaeology and dietary preferences. They separated the animal bones based on what kind of pottery the animal bones were found with. Mesopotamian pottery or local pottery, and then analyzed the percentages of different species that were consumed. And what they saw is that, in general, animal bones that were found with local pottery, there was many more, a real prevalence, you can see here, not just on sheep and goat, but also pig and some cattle. Mesopotamians were eating the same thing, we think, because the bones in or similar kind of diet, but with an important difference. When they looked at the bones with Mesopotamian pottery, they found sheep, pig, and cattle as well, but the majority, overwhelming majority, 83% of the bones were from sheep or goat. Only a little bit from pig and only a little bit from cattle. Now, what's interesting about this is that this diet that you see associated with Mesopotamian pottery, these preferences for sheep and goat, are the same as dietary preferences in southern Mesopotamia, in the city of Uruk. So, we would say that not only are the local dietary preferences different from the Mesopotamian dietary preference at the site, but the Mesopotamian dietary preferences are identical to their homeland. So it really seems like Mesopotamians were at the site, because pottery styles are something that's conscious. You consciously make them, but the kinds of foods that you crave or your diet can be more unconscious than conscious, right? You grow up, let's say, in a certain country or a certain ethnic group. You really like those foods. You end up, let's say, wanting to eat those foods in your adult life. So Mesopotamians really liked, lamb kebab, and maybe weren't that crazy about pork and cattle. So ethnic food preferences sometimes can be a marker for identity and ethnicity that can show up archaeologically, and that could be stronger in identifying ethnicity than pottery styles. I'll give you one more example. And then you're going to look at economy, how we study ancient economy. But around the time of the 13th century BC, so we're talking about the 1200s BC, this is the time period that corresponds to the biblical account of the Israelites moving into the land of Canaan. What archaeologists find is a lot of small settlements appearing in now what's Palestine or the West Bank, very small kind of villages, and they're similar to other Canaanite villages in the area, but we see a kind of a real surge in small villages. Now, is there any way to identify these people or this population surge as Israelites? It's really hard. But what's interesting is that these supposed Israelite settlements, when you compare the diet to Canaanite settlements around, there's no pork found in these hill settlements. And so some people have hypothesized that the kosher taboo against pork was already in place, and this is a way possibly to identify ancient Israelite settlements. That's a good possibility. Again, another attempt at using zooarchaeology to look at ethnic preferences. Okay, now you guys are going to learn about ancient economy. If you've taken a course in economics, you know about supply and demand and macroeconomics and microeconomics. A lot of those things apply to ancient economics, but systems of these ancient societies are different than many of the market systems we're familiar with today. But what you're going to see in a video that I've posted, it's an excellent video from a series called Out of the Past. It was made by Penn State University by their anthropology department. What you're going to see is that many of the artifacts that we recover in the archaeological site tell us something about the ancient economy. And so the ancient economy is a very important aspect of study in archaeology. And so you're going to learn about ancient economy, and then I'm going to also give you sort of my 2 cents on it as well.